At 3:52 in the afternoon, after 55 minutes of searching, Nora Vance stepped off the freight elevator on the 14th floor of the Corrigan Hotel on West 4th Street with her phone still pressed to her ear and stopped mid-word. Past a wall of plastic sheeting, at the end of a corridor that smelled like wet drywall, her daughter was talking. Wen Vance, 7 years old, 14 months without a single word, 2 hospitals, 1 residential program in Asheville, 31 specialists, and a diagnosis that changed every time somebody new looked at the file. Now she sat cross-legged on plywood subfloor beside a man in a reflective vest, a man Nora had never met, and her voice, thin, rusted from disuse, carried down the hall clear enough to hear. "Daddy." The phone slid out of her hand. It didn't break. It landed face up on the plastic sheeting and kept ringing. Nora didn't move. She couldn't have told you in that moment whether the word had been aimed at the stranger crouched beside her daughter or simply released into the air the way a held breath finally goes, but it didn't matter which. Either way, it was the first word Wren had spoken to a living person in 431 days, and it was not her mother's name. 9 hours earlier, at 6:15 in the morning, 11 minutes from the sitter's apartment in Bay Ridge, the call had come in, and Nora had listened to a woman apologize for 90 seconds without absorbing a single sentence of it. The sitter's father had a stroke overnight. The sitter was already on the Belt Parkway heading for LaGuardia. There was no version of that call that ended with anyone standing in Nora's kitchen that morning or that week. "I understand," Nora had said, which wasn't true, and hung up. She made 4 calls in the next 6 minutes. The agency had no one bonded on short notice. Her assistant, Priya, was already at the Corrigan managing 72 contractors and a closing that was 11 days out. Her brother in Hartford laughed before he caught himself. Nora set the phone face down on the counter and looked at her daughter through the hallway mirror. Wren sat at the kitchen table with her school backpack already on, a tin of pastel pencils open in front of her, drawing the way she'd drawn every morning for 14 months, with her whole small body bent into it, silent and entirely somewhere else. "Sweetheart, you're going to have to come with me today." Wren turned a page. "There's a building. It's a hotel we're buying. It's going to be a very long, very boring day, and I know this is the last week of summer, and I know this isn't what you wanted." Nothing. "Is that all right?" Nothing. Nora took the next exit toward the Corrigan anyway. She kept talking because the quiet in the car had a weight to it she'd never learned to sit inside. She asked if Wren was warm enough. She asked if she'd finished her cereal. She asked what she was drawing, and got as far as asking if the tower in the corner of the page had a name before she caught herself watching her own daughter in the rearview mirror the way you'd watch a bird you were afraid to startle off a windsill. 11 questions between the bridge and the parking garage, not one answer. The specialists had words for it: selective mutism, trauma adjacent, grief onset, one had written, and then, when Nora pushed him, added the word possibly in front of it as if that made it easier to hear. 2 hospitals, 31 clinicians, a waiting list in Asheville she had paid to skip twice. One of them, a Dr. O'Coffer, had told her gently that some children go quiet not because something is missing, but because someone is, and Nora ended that appointment early and never gone back because the word someone had a shape to it she wasn't ready to look at directly. At a red light on Lafayette, she checked the mirror again. Wren had picked up a gray pencil and shaded the underside of a bridge, the same bridge, always unfinished, always split in the middle, like 2 hands that couldn't quite reach. "Okay," Nora said, mostly to herself, "we'll make it work." The Corrigan took up half a city block, 98 years old, wrapped in scaffolding from the 3rd floor up. Vance Holdings was 11 days from closing on it. The renovation had been running 4 months under the outgoing ownership group, which meant that for 11 days the mess belonged to someone else, and the outcome belonged to her.
Douglas Reyes met her in the lobby before she had her coat off, mid-50s, gray at the temples, head of development for Halbrook Meridian, the general contractor running the renovation, a man with a kind of unhurried warmth that came from never once having to raise his voice to get what he wanted. He looked past Nora's outstretched hand, crouched slightly, and offered his own to Wren first. "Douglas Reyes, you must be the boss's boss."
Wren looked at his hand for a long moment, then she shook it once, quick, and let go. "That's a serious sketchbook," Reyes said, straightening up. "Professional grade. Nora, good morning. You look like a woman who's had a morning. My sitter's father had a stroke. There was no one else. Then she stays with us," Reyes said, the way a man decides the weather is fine. He walked her towards the ballroom with a hand hovering an inch off her shoulder. "Before you ask, and I know you'll ask, we're clean. Structural is buttoned up on 14, mechanical is a week ahead, and the inspection package is assembling itself as we speak. We're perfectly on schedule." "Nothing is perfectly on schedule. This is," he said, and smiled the way he always smiled, like it cost him nothing because it was. She sat Wren at the end of the registration table with a plate of melon and a glass of juice, told her twice not to wander, asked Priya to keep half an eye on her between calls, and went into a room where 81 people each wanted a piece of her afternoon. It ran long. It always ran long. At 3:40, Norna came out of the ballroom with her phone already at her ear and looked towards the registration table. The chair was empty. The plate was there. The juice was there. The sketchbook was gone. 14 floors up, the freight corridor smelled like fresh concrete dust, and Eli Marsh had shut the entire run down over something the width of a thumbnail. 39 years old, built narrow and hard through the shoulders, site supervisor for Iron Line Structural since the job broke ground. He stood under a run of unfinished ductwork with a laser level in one hand and a torn spec sheet folded into quarters in the other, and he did not look angry, which somehow made it worse. For the 3 men waiting on him, "Anchor's off. It should be 5/8. It's off by enough that it matters." One of the crew said it was close enough to pass. Eli handed him the folded sheet without raising his voice. "Pull it back to the column. Relay off the print, not off the last guy's holes. That's half a day. Then it's half a day." He said it the way he said everything, without heat, and that ended the conversation. The crew broke for their bags. Eli wrote something short in a battered notebook he kept in his back pocket, clipped the pen to the cover, and put it away. On the lid of his open tool bag, doing nothing in particular, sat a worn brass coin the size of a silver dollar, a trident struck into the face of it, dark in the grooves from years of being carried. On a stack of banded supply crates near the window, a girl of 8 sat with a math worksheet balanced on her knee, watching it all with the calm of someone who had watched a great deal of it before. "You made them redo it," Mara Marsh said. "I did. They're mad. They'll be less mad in November when the ceiling doesn't sag." He tugged the worksheet an inch straighter. "Fractions. Thought you finished those." "I did. This is the extra one." "Then you're ahead of me." Behind them, past the plastic sheeting, where the corridor narrowed towards the stairwell, a small figure in an oversized yellow visitor's vest stood absolutely still, and nobody noticed her at all. Eli unrolled the 14th floor drawing across a clean stretch of subfloor and weighted the corners with a hammer, a coffee cup, and his own boot. "Come look at this," he said to Mara. She slid off the crates and crouched beside him. He traced a line of hatching along the bottom of the sheet. "That's the foundation. Nobody's ever going to see it. People are going to walk through that lobby in 10 years and never think about what's underneath them." He tapped it twice. The part nobody sees is the part holding everything else up. He had not looked towards the plastic sheathing once, though he'd known for 3 minutes that it had moved. He reached into his vest pocket, took out a gray pencil worn down to half its length, and set it on the drawing. Then he pushed it gently across the paper, away from himself, towards the empty air on the other side. "I drew that bridge wrong," he said to Mara, tapping a gap in the print where a span should have closed. "Right there. Somebody ought to fix it for me." Mara opened her mouth to volunteer, saw her father's hand flatten slightly on the floor, closed it again. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then came the soft scuff of sneakers on dust, and Eli Vance stepped out from behind the sheeting, knelt at the third open side of the drawing, and picked up the pencil. She didn't close the gap. She drew, in the margin, a second bridge entirely, taller, with towers, drawn with a steadiness that had nothing childish in it. Mara leaned in until her hair nearly touched the paper. "Who's that for?" Wren didn't answer her. She looked up instead, past Mara, at the man crouched over the print, at the gray at his jaw, the coin on the bag, the quiet way he'd once turned to stare at her, and something in her face came loose, like a knot finally given enough slack to slip. "Daddy," she said. Behind them, out past the plastic, something hit the marble floor by the elevators and cracked.
Nora didn't remember crossing the corridor. She remembered being at the elevators and then being 14 floors up with her hand closed around her daughter's shoulder and Eli Marsh rising slowly to his feet with his hands loose at his sides in the particular way of a man who had learned somewhere how to stand in front of someone frightened. "What did you tell her to call you?" "Nothing, ma'am." "Don't tell me nothing. 14 months, 31 doctors, and she just—" Her voice went somewhere she couldn't control, and she reeled it back in. "I didn't tell her anything," Eli said. "It's the whole truth of it. I know it's not much of an answer. It's the only one I've got. Eli Marsh, Iron Line Structural. I run the crew on this floor." He nodded at the drawing. "She's been standing at the end of that hall about 10 minutes. I figured if I said anything to her first, she'd go." Nora looked down. Her daughter was still kneeling on the plywood in a vest 3 sizes too big, and the word was still sitting in the air where it had landed, and neither of them could put it anywhere yet. "Wren," Nora said, "we're going downstairs." She reached for her hand, and Wren, without standing, without looking up, closed her fingers around the cuff of her mother's sleeve and held on. It was the first time in 14 months her daughter had reached for her. Nora stood there with her heart going hard against her ribs and every instinct telling her to end this, remove her child from a construction floor and a stranger she hadn't vetted, call Dr. O'Coffer, handle it the way she had built an entire life out of handling things. She looked at the small hand on her sleeve. Then she pulled a supply crate from the wall, sat down on it in her coat at the edge of the plastic sheeting, and said nothing at all. Eli watched her a moment. Then he crouched back down at the drawing, murmured something to Mara about the bridge, and let both girls return to the paper as if nothing had happened. By the next morning, Nora turned a miracle into a folder. A visitor waiver the building's insurer required for anyone above floor 3. A rider her own counsel drafted overnight naming Iron Line and Howbrook Meridian so that nothing happening on that floor could ever land on Eli Marsh personally. A child-sized hard hat ordered at midnight, delivered by 9, white, chin strap still in its plastic sleeve. She carried all of it up herself and laid it on the crates like a proposal. "You did this last night?" Eli said, turning the pages slowly, one finger holding his place. "I did. Most people would have just brought her back up and hoped for the best. I'm not most people. If she's going to be here, she's going to be here properly. If that's a problem, tell me now." "It's not a problem." He turned another page. "But I want to say something once so it doesn't turn into a problem later. What she called me yesterday, I didn't ask for that, and I'm not going to lean into it. I had a wife. Wren doesn't have a father in the picture anymore, from what I can tell, and a word like that is not small. I won't pretend it is, and I won't chase it either. I'm not asking you to be anything. I know, I'm telling you what I'm not going to do, so we're both clear." He signed the last page, clipped the pen to his sight log, handed the folder back. "Hat stays on. She stands where Mara stands. When I say move, she moves. No discussion. Understood." For the rest of that week, the arrangement held in a shape neither adult would have designed. Nora's days ran 7 to 7 in a borrowed conference room 2 floors down, and twice a day she climbed the freight stairs in heels to stand at the end of the corridor in heels and watch her daughter from 30 feet away, like checking the weather. It was Mara who did the talking mostly, the way kids do when they've learned a friendship has a shelf life. "This is my 4th job site," she told Wren on the 3rd day, sorting pencils by color, because Wren let her. 3 schools. I'm really good at the first 2 weeks. I'm just not good at the part after." She held one up. "Blue or green?" Wren took it, looked, set it in the green pile. See, that's what I fought. Mara reached over and turned the brass coin so the trident faced up. That's my dad's from the Navy. He doesn't talk about it, so don't ask. 2 aisles over, in the second-floor staging room, unnoticed, Wren wandered down after lunch and stopped near a row of pallets where 2 men in Halbrook vests were peeling labels off anchor crates with a heat gun, pressing new ones down with a thumb, twice, hard. Douglas Reyes stood at the head of the row in a gray suit, pointing, not talking much, just pointing, the way a man points when he's counting something he doesn't want counted by anyone else. Wren sat against a pallet, opened her sketchbook, and drew all of it, exactly, the way she copied everything now. A number burned into wood under a lifted label, a hand extended, a sleeve pulling tight at the shoulder.
That night, Dr. O'Coffer called from a car between 2 other calls. I want to be encouraging, but I also want to be responsible with you because I've watched families ride this exact wave before, and I don't want you underwater when it breaks. A turn signal ticked behind her voice. What you're describing is situational speech, tied to one adult in one location under very specific conditions. When that environment ends, and it will end, Nora, the renovation will finish, the regression is usually faster than the gain was. Thank you, Nora said. I have to go. She hung up before the woman could soften it and stood in her dark kitchen with the sketchbook in front of her on the counter and did something she'd never once done in 14 months. She opened it and actually looked. Page after page, the same skyline, the same unfinished bridge, 2 halves reaching for each other and never touching. Near the back, a page of a warehouse, men, numbers that she turned past without much thought. She caught Eli at 7:15 the next morning before the crew came up. I want to propose something, she said, a folder on the crate lid, a consulting position, family engagement on the books of the foundation, so there's no conflict with the construction contract, $2,000 a month, health coverage, a housing allowance. It means if Iron Line loses this bid, you don't move, she doesn't move. Eli didn't touch it. No. You haven't read it. I don't need to. Ma'am, what's happening on that floor right now is a kid sitting there drawing, and I'm not asking her for one single thing. The moment there's a number attached to me being around her, I'm asking her for something every day, whether I mean to or not. She'd feel it before either of us did. I'm trying to keep this from being taken away from her. I know you are. He stood. You're not paying me to be here. You're paying so you don't have to be. She sat in the borrowed conference room with the door shut for a long time after that, furious in the specific way of someone told a true thing she couldn't argue with. At some point, without deciding to, she opened a folder in her phone she hadn't touched in 14 months. 9 voicemails, all from a 6-minute window on a Tuesday in June, all from a number saved under Marcus, her husband. She pressed the first one. Rain. Wen's voice, small and steady, doing exactly what she'd been taught. Daddy's not waking up. I called 911. They're coming. The last one had come in at 6:40 that evening. By 6:40, Nora had been 40 minutes into closing a deal, phone in a box by the door, at her own request. She listened to all 9, twice, sitting on the kitchen floor, in the dark. Wen had called for help. Wen had stayed on the line, narrating the road, the bridge, the rain, so her father wouldn't be alone right up until an ambulance arrived and it was already too late. She had done everything a 7-year-old could do, and the one person who should have been reachable that evening had turned her phone off to close a deal. 2 days later, an anchor cluster let go on the north side of the 14th floor. A section of ductwork came down, and a rigger named Sam Ortiz went off the lift and hit the deck with his arm under him. Eli was on his knees beside him in under 4 seconds, cutting the sleeve instead of pulling it, splinting, timing the pulse, calm the way he'd been calm his whole life, ever since the Navy. By noon, Douglas Reyes stood in the middle of the shut-down floor in a gray suit, unhurried.
We have a flagged condition, in writing, 9 days before an injury under the same supervisor who kept running crews beneath it. I can't have him on this floor while that's investigated. It's not personal. Badge, please." 9 men watched a man hand over his badge, and not one word anybody could write down had been said. Nora caught him in the loading bay. "There's a firm on the 12th floor of my building. I'll cover the lawyer, the lab, your pay while this runs." "No." He set his level in the truck bed. "When Angela died, her parents paid the mortgage for a while. Then, a year in, they explained Mara would go to school near them instead, and they'd talk to somebody about custody. It took me 2 years and a lawyer I couldn't afford to get out under that kindness. I'll never do it again. Owing somebody means losing the right to say no." She left her number on the seat of his truck anyway. He didn't take the card, but he didn't leave it behind either. That evening, Reyes came to Nora's house to be helpful and mentioned gently that a man in his 40s spending that much time near a rich man's daughter was worth a second look. Not an accusation, just something somebody else might say if this got loud. He said it in front of the stairs. He didn't know Wen was sitting on the 3rd step in the dark, sketchbook against her chest, listening to a man threaten to take away the one person she'd finally trusted enough to call by a name. By morning, she wasn't speaking again.
For 4 mornings, Ren said nothing. Nora went into her room to strip the bed and found the wicker basket by the desk, one page crushed white at the creases. She worked it open with her thumbs. The warehouse, the labels, the number under the sticker, the man with his arm out, pointing. She knew that shoulder. She'd shaken that hand in the lobby on the first morning of all of this. She didn't call anyone. She got tape, sat on the floor, and mended the tear at the spine. "I listened to your voicemails," she said, not asking Ren to answer. "All 9, twice. You did everything right. You called for help, you stayed on the line so he wouldn't be alone. You were 7, and you did every single thing right, and it still didn't save him. I need you to hear the next part clearly, because I think you've been carrying it alone. And it was never yours. It didn't fail because talking doesn't work. It failed because I had my phone in a box by a door closing a deal, and I wasn't reachable. That's the whole reason. I am so sorry." Ren didn't answer, but she climbed down off the bed, sat against her mother's arm, and stayed. The review hearing ran Thursday at 9. Reyes brought paper for everyone, a clean trail, and approved substitution, a timeline that pointed at Eli and nowhere else. Eli set his sight log on the table, refusal dated in his own hand, but no witness to the label swap itself. The hole in the case was exactly the hole Reyes had built it around. The door opened. Ren walked the length of the table and put the crumpled taped drawing in front of the safety officer, right side up. 4417, she said. Her voice was small, rusted, and completely clear. "It's burned into the wood under the sticker. He heats it and he peels it in one piece, and they push the new one down, twice with a thumb." She pointed at the man at the head of the row. "He told them which ones. He didn't say much. He just pointed." She looked up at Reyes for the first time. "You put my head on my head, and then you walked away because you thought I couldn't tell anybody." The lab found 30 anchors that failed to rate. Reyes's name came off the letterhead within the month. Eli was hired as project manager on the rebuild, on the strength of a sight log and a 7-year-old's memory, nothing else. 6 months later, the Corrigan's lobby reopened, 98-year-old marble under new light. 2 girls sat by the window with a stub of gray pencil, closing the last gap in a bridge drawn 40 times, unfinished. Behind them, their parents stood without speaking, and neither one reached for a phone. Ren looked up once at Eli and said it again, quieter this time, no longer a first word, just a true one. "Daddy."